Think about someone you love or someone you used to love. Now ask yourself this honestly. How much of what you feel for them is actually about them, and how much of it is about the version of them you carry in your head? The version that fits your story, the version that explains your history, the version you need them to be. Iris Murdoch spent her life asking this question, not as an abstract philosophical puzzle, but as the most practical question there is. Can we ever really see another person, or are we always, to some degree, looking at ourselves? Her answer was uncomfortable, and it changed the way she understood everything: love, morality, what it actually means to be good. Murdoch was born in Dublin in 1919 and grew up in London. She studied classics at Oxford, served as a civil servant during the war, and eventually became a philosopher and novelist, writing 26 novels over her career while simultaneously doing serious philosophical work. She was one of the most unusual thinkers of the 20th century, someone who believed that philosophy and storytelling were not two different activities, but the same activity approached from different angles. Both novels and philosophy, she thought, are about the same thing, trying to see reality clearly. And both are harder than they look, because reality keeps getting filtered through the self. What she discovered in her philosophical work was something she also found in her personal life. She was capable of being deeply, genuinely wrong about the people she loved. Not just mistaken about their opinions or preferences, wrong about who they were. She had built versions of people in her mind that served her needs, her fears, her sense of how the story was supposed to go. And then reality would intrude, and the person in front of her would turn out to be someone other than the one she had been relating to. She wrote about this directly, using a thought experiment that became one of the most famous examples in modern philosophy. A woman she calls her M has a daughter-in-law she privately thinks of as vulgar and immature. The daughter-in-law has done nothing wrong. M simply does not like her. Over time, M makes an effort to look more carefully, not to change her opinion, but to see more clearly. And gradually, slowly, her view shifts. She begins to see that what she called vulgarity was actually directness. What she called immaturity was actually freshness. The daughter-in-law hasn't changed. M's vision has. This, for Murdoch, is what moral life actually is. Not the big moments, not the dramatic choices. It is the slow, continuous work of learning to see. Here is the moment that made Murdoch famous in philosophical circles, but described the way she actually wrote it. She is sitting at her desk. She is anxious about something, a small wound, to her pride, maybe. She is turning it over, worrying it, building a case in her head. She is, as she put it, brooding on some damage done to her prestige. Then she looks up, and there is a Kestrel, hovering outside her window, perfectly still in the air, completely indifferent to her and her problems. And in that moment, she writes, everything changed. The brooding self with its hurt vanity, it disappeared. There was nothing now but the Kestrel. When she returned to her thoughts, the thing that had seemed so important seemed, suddenly, less so. What happened? Nothing dramatic, no revelation, no resolution of whatever was bothering her. The problem was still there. But for a moment, her attention had moved off herself and onto something genuinely other, and in that moment, the grip of her ego loosened. This, she said, is what paying attention actually does. Not just to Kestrels, to other people, to music, to anything that is genuinely real and genuinely separate from you. The moment you truly look at something outside yourself, the self steps back, and when the self steps back, you can see more clearly. Murdoch thought this was not a rare experience. She thought most people have had moments like that, when a bird or a piece of music or a conversation pulled them completely out of themselves for a few seconds. And she thought those moments were not trivial. They were, she said, practice for the most important thing there is, learning to see other people as real. If you have ever had a moment like that, something that just suddenly made the thing you were worrying about seem small, leave it in the comments. I am genuinely curious what it was. Subscribe to The Lucid Mind. Not to add another channel to your list, because this is exactly the kind of question this channel exists for. Murdoch had a phrase for the main obstacle to seeing clearly. She called it the fat, relentless ego. Not the ego in the Freudian sense, not some specific part of the mind, just the ordinary self, with all its ordinary concerns, its need to be right, its need to be liked, its narratives about how things are supposed to go, its habit of turning everything it encounters into material for its own story. The fat ego is not dramatic. It is not narcissism or cruelty. It is just the persistent, low-level hum of self-concern that most of us carry around most of the time, filtering everything through the question, what does this mean for me? And here is what the fat ego does to relationships. When you meet someone, you do not meet them directly. You meet your first impression of them, which becomes your working model of them, which becomes the template through which all future interactions are interpreted. Every new thing they do gets filtered through what you already believe about them. Things that fit the template are noticed. Things that do not fit are explained away, minimized, or simply not registered. This is not cruelty. It is how human perception works. But it means that the person you think you are in relationship with is, to a significant degree, a projection, a construction. Your story about who they are, running continuously in the background, shaping everything you see. Murdoch did not think this was hopeless. But she did think it meant that seeing another person clearly required something active, something that had to be worked at, not just opening your eyes and looking. She drew a distinction between two modes of inner life that she thought most people never quite articulate. The first is fantasy, and she did not mean fantasy in the sense of daydreaming or imagination. She meant the constant, low-level stream of self-serving stories we tell ourselves about the world. The replay of a conversation where you say the perfect thing. The imagined confrontation where you are clearly right. The narrative you build about why you were treated unfairly or why you deserve the credit you didn't get. Fantasy, in Murdoch's sense, is any inner activity that keeps you at the center of your own story. It feels like thinking, but it isn't. It is the ego feeding itself. It is the mind turned inward, elaborating on itself, making itself more comfortable. Attention is the opposite. Attention is when the mind turns genuinely outward, not to use what it finds, not to interpret it into something familiar, but simply to look, to let what is there be there. The difference sounds simple. It is not, because fantasy is comfortable and attention is uncomfortable. Fantasy keeps the self in control. Attention requires putting the self aside, which the self resists. But here is what changes. When you pay genuine attention to another person, you start to see things about them that don't fit your story, complications, contradictions, depths you hadn't registered. And slowly, the person in front of you becomes more real. Not more understandable in the sense of fitting neatly into a category. More real in the sense of being genuinely separate from you, genuinely their own thing with their own interior life that you are only barely touching. Murdoch had a name for what happens when you manage to move from fantasy to attention. She called it unselfing. Unselfing is not self-improvement. It is not therapy. It is not achieving some better version of yourself. It is, much more simply, the temporary suspension of the self's constant need to be the center of things. And she thought it happened most naturally through beauty. When you see something beautiful, genuinely beautiful, the way the Kestrel was, the self does not have to work to get out of the way. It just does. Beauty pulls attention outward. The self forgets to be in charge for a moment. Art works the same way, she thought. Good fiction, good music, good painting, they demand that you inhabit a reality that is not yours. They pull your attention into a world where you are not the protagonist. And in doing that, they train you in the thing that matters most, the capacity to give your full attention to something genuinely other than yourself. Which is, she said, exactly what love requires. Love, in Murdoch's sense, is not a feeling. It is not the state of being very fond of someone or very attracted to someone. Love, in her definition, is something much more demanding. It is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. Read that again. Not an emotion, a realization. The recognition that this person in front of you, with all their complexity, all their contradictions, all their needs and fears and history, is genuinely real as you are. Not an extension of your story, not a character in your narrative, a whole separate person, existing independently of you. This, she said, is the hardest thing there is, and most of what we call love never fully gets there. Here is where it gets personal. Think about a relationship you have been in, romantic, or friendship, or family, where at some point you discovered that the person was significantly different from who you thought they were. Most people experience this as a kind of betrayal. They feel misled, deceived. The person turned out not to be who they thought. But Murdoch would say, were they different, or did you just start seeing them more clearly? Because in most cases, the person did not change. Your picture of them changed. The details that didn't fit your template finally accumulated enough that they could no longer be explained away. The reality of the other person broke through the story you had built around them. And this is painful, she would say, not because reality is painful. It is painful because the self invested in the story. The self had reasons for seeing them the way it did, reasons connected to your own needs, your own fears, your own history. The story about them was also, always, a story about you. This is what the fat ego does in relationships. It does not set out to see inaccurately. It just keeps interpreting, keeps filtering, keeps constructing all of it in service of the self's need to make sense of things in a particular way. Murdoch thought this was the central problem of human life. Not evil, not weakness, not failure of will. Just this, the ordinary, persistent, very human tendency to see the world through the lens of the self and to mistake that picture for reality. What Murdoch proposed as a response was not a technique. She was suspicious of techniques. What she proposed was to practice something much closer to an orientation than a method. She called it moral vision, the ongoing effort to see people and situations as they actually are, rather than as yourself needs them to be. Moral vision, she said, is not about making better choices. It is about developing better sight, because better choices follow almost automatically from seeing more clearly. Most of our moral failures are not failures of will. They are failures of attention. We hurt people not because we choose to, but because we do not see them clearly enough to understand what we are doing. And the way you develop moral vision is not through effort alone. You cannot will yourself to see more clearly. But you can choose what you give your attention to. You can choose objects of attention that pull the self outward, things that are genuinely other, genuinely beautiful, genuinely complex, great art, nature, other people, approached with the intention of actually listening, rather than waiting for your turn to speak. Each time you do this, each time your attention genuinely moves off yourself and onto something real, the capacity for it grows, slowly, unglamorously, without any single dramatic moment of transformation. Murdoch did not offer lists of steps. She thought moral life was too complex for steps. But she did describe one thing that she thought was the foundation of everything else: the practice of asking about anyone you find yourself judging, reacting to, or feeling strongly about. Am I seeing this person, or am I seeing my story about them? Not to answer the question definitively, you usually cannot, but to hold it open, to treat the person in front of you, or the person in your memory, as potentially different from the version you have built. To admit the possibility that you are missing something about them, not because you are bad, but because the ego always misses something about everyone. This is genuinely difficult. It is especially difficult with the people closest to you, because the stories about them are the most elaborate and the most invested in. It is easiest with strangers, with people who have not yet had time to become characters in your narrative. But it is available. In any conversation, in any relationship, in any moment of judgment or reaction, there is a small gap between the stimulus and the response. And in that gap, you can pause and ask, is this the person, or is this my story about the person? Over time, that pause builds something, not certainty, not the elimination of projection that is not possible, but a slightly wider space between what you see and what you assume. A slightly more honest relationship with your own limitations as an observer. Murdoch would say, that is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole of moral life. Iris Murdoch died in 1999. Having spent the final years of her life with Alzheimer's disease, a profound and painful irony for someone who spent decades arguing that clarity of vision is the central work of human existence. She left behind 26 novels and a body of philosophical work that has never quite received the recognition it deserves. She is still primarily known as a novelist, and her philosophy is still regularly treated as a kind of hobby that accompanied her real work. This is, to use her own language, a failure of attention. What she understood about human nature is as precise and as difficult as anything in the canon, maybe more so because she did not let it stay abstract. She kept returning it to the ordinary, to what actually happens when you look at someone you love, to what actually moves through your mind in the moment before you speak. The fat, relentless ego is not going anywhere. It is not something you defeat or transcend. It is the default condition of being a self. But it is not all there is. There are kestrels. There is music. There are moments when another person says something that stops you, and for a second you actually see them, not the story, not the projection, not the version that fits your narrative, just them, as they actually are, separate from you and real. Those moments do not last, but they are worth everything. Subscribe to the Lucid Mind. Think deeper, live clearer.